What if everything you thought you knew about medieval education was wrong? What if the quiet cloisters of the 12th century held more intellectual power than the bustling marketplaces? Prepare to have your mind blown by how medieval nuns, in the era spanning roughly 500 to 1500 CE, were often miles ahead in learning compared to most men of their time. Number 1. Scientific observation. The image of a medieval nun often brings to mind prayer and contemplation. But tucked away in the quiet corners of their convents, many were sharp observers of the natural world, engaging in forms of scientific inquiry that far outstripped the understanding of the average man of their era. While not operating with microscopes or telescopes as we know them today, their methodical observations and detailed record-keeping provided a deep, practical understanding of their environment. For instance, the celestial movements were not just subjects of theological wonder. They were critical for determining the liturgical calendar, which dictated the rhythm of convent life, including the dates for important feast days and fasting periods. Nuns often maintained detailed astronomical charts, carefully noting the positions of stars, the phases of the moon, and the solstices. This was not a casual glance. It was a precise, often nightly, dedication. At the Abbey of Disibodenberg in the 12th century, it is understood that the community included sisters who meticulously tracked planetary shifts. These records, carefully inscribed on parchment, allowed them to predict astronomical events with a surprising degree of accuracy for their time, a skill almost entirely absent from the everyday lives of laymen who relied on the church or local almanacs. Beyond the heavens, the earth beneath their feet was another rich source of scientific observation. Convent gardens were not merely for growing food. They were living laboratories for botanical studies. Nuns cultivated vast arrays of herbs, not just for cooking, but primarily for medicinal purposes. They would observe the growth cycles of plants, the precise timing of their flowering, and the specific conditions that allowed them to thrive. Records from the Convent of Ruprechtberg, also in the 12th century, suggest that Sister Heloise compiled extensive documentation on the properties of various plants, noting which parts were most effective for particular ailments and the best methods for preparation. Her detailed notes, sometimes accompanied by rough sketches, cataloged hundreds of species, a depth of botanical knowledge that very few men outside specialized medical schools, which were still nascent, could ever hope to rival. They understood the nuances of soil, light, and water, experimenting with different growing techniques to maximize yields and potency. This practical application of observation led to a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology, long before the term was widely used. Furthermore, some nuns engaged in rudimentary engineering and physics through the necessity of maintaining their complex monastic structures. They understood the principles of water flow for irrigation systems, the mechanics of counterweights for bells, and the structural integrity required for their buildings. While they might not have articulated these concepts in theoretical terms, their practical application demonstrated an intuitive grasp of forces and materials. For example, during renovations or expansions, nuns often advised on the best placement for new structures or how to reinforce existing ones. Construction of watermills, which many convents operated, required a deep understanding of fluid dynamics and mechanical advantage. At the Abbey of Hohenberg in the 11th century, it is reported that Abbess Harad oversaw the design of a new aqueduct system to bring fresh water directly into the convent, a project that required careful calculation of gradient and flow rate. This practical engineering knowledge was highly specialized, a skill set usually confined to master builders or engineers, a rarity among the general populace. Nuns, by living within these self-contained, self-sufficient communities, were compelled to acquire a broad range of practical and observational knowledge that would have been inaccessible or irrelevant to most men whose daily lives were often consumed by manual labor, warfare, or simple trade, none of which demanded the same depth of intellectual engagement with the natural world. Number 2. Literacy. In a time when the vast majority of the population, including most men, were illiterate, the ability to read and write was a distinguishing mark of education. For medieval nuns, literacy was not merely a desirable skill, it was a fundamental requirement for their very existence within the monastic order. From the moment a young woman entered the convent as a novice, she was immersed in a world of written words, the very rhythm of their daily life, structured around the divine office, demanded the ability to read complex Latin texts, primarily the Psalms, prayers, and lessons. This was not simply rote memorization. It required an understanding of the text, its structure, and its meaning. Records from the Convent of Helfta in the 13th century reveal that even new entrants, if they arrived without basic literacy, were immediately taught to read and write Latin, a language that was the lingua franca of scholarship, theology, and administration across Europe. Proficiency extended beyond simple decoding. Nuns were expected to engage with the texts, to meditate upon them, and to derive spiritual insight from their diligent study. The act of reading for a medieval nun was often a public and communal affair. During chapter meetings, meals, and liturgical services, one nun would often read aloud to the others, a practice that sharpened their comprehension and pronunciation skills. This constant exposure to the written word in a systematic and disciplined manner cultivated a high degree of fluency. They read not just religious texts, but also patristic writings, commentaries, and sometimes even classical literature, depending on the library's collection. For example, at the Abbey of Las Huelgas, it is understood that the nuns regularly read the works of St. Augustine and St. Gregory the Great, engaging with their theological complexities. This level of engagement with foundational texts was a far cry from the limited literacy, if any, of most men, whose written world often extended no further than simple contracts or bills. If they could even read those, beyond reading, writing was an equally crucial skill. Nuns were often tasked with copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, a dedicated room for this painstaking work. This involved not just transcribing text, but also ensuring accuracy, consistency, and sometimes even beautification through illumination. The very act of copying demanded an intimate familiarity with Latin grammar, spelling, and various scripts. They would prepare the parchment, mix the inks, and carefully form each letter, a process that could take months for a single volume. This meticulous labor owned their writing skills to a degree that was professional and artistic. An example might be the Benedictine nuns of Chelles, who, as historical accounts suggest, were renowned for their exquisite calligraphy and precise transcriptions of sacred texts in the Carolingian era. They produced books that were not only legible but also works of art, demonstrating a mastery of both the linguistic and aesthetic aspects of writing. Furthermore, nuns used their literacy for practical administrative purposes. They kept detailed records of the convent's finances, property, and legal affairs. They wrote letters to other religious houses, to their superiors, to noble patrons, and sometimes even to kings and popes. This correspondence required not only clear and precise writing, but also an understanding of formal address and rhetorical conventions. Abbesses, in particular, were expected to manage vast estates and complex legal matters, all of which necessitated strong literacy and administrative writing skills. The ability to draft a legal document or persuasive letter was a mark of significant intellectual capacity in a society where oral agreements were still common due to widespread illiteracy. Their literacy was not just for spiritual edification. It was a practical tool that empowered them to manage complex institutions and engage with the wider world on terms of intellectual equality, if not superiority, to many of their male counterparts. Number 3. Access to libraries. While many men of the medieval period, especially commoners, might never have seen a book in their entire lives, let alone owned one, medieval nuns were often members of institutions that possessed some of the most comprehensive and well-maintained libraries of their era. These monastic libraries were repositories of knowledge, ranging from sacred scriptures and theological commentaries to classical literature, scientific treatises, and historical chronicles. The very presence of such extensive collections within the convent walls provided nuns with an unparalleled opportunity for intellectual growth. Unlike the general populace, who relied on oral traditions or occasional public readings, nuns had direct daily access to a wealth of written information. The libraries were not just storage spaces, they were active centers of study and intellectual pursuit, often housing rooms dedicated specifically for reading and contemplation. The types of books available to nuns were remarkably diverse. Beyond the essential liturgical texts like the Bible, psalters, and breviaries, many convent libraries boasted collections of patristic writings from figures like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. These texts provided the foundation for theological understanding and intellectual debate. Records from the Abbey of Gandersheim, for example, reveal that its library in the 10th century contained not only religious works, but also classical Latin authors such as Virgil, Terence, and prudential Roman thought and literature. This exposure to classical learning was rare outside of a few nascent universities and select cathedral schools which were primarily male domains. For a layman, even a wealthy one, possessing such a diverse collection of books would have been an exceptional luxury, and understanding them would have required a level of literacy and scholarly training he likely lacked. Acquiring books was a continuous process for convent libraries. While some books were purchased, many were copied within the convent's own scriptorium, as discussed previously, ensuring a steady growth of their collection. Books were also often received as donations from noble patrons, bishops, or other religious houses, reflecting the high regard in which these libraries were held. Care taken in preserving these precious volumes was immense. Books were carefully shelved, sometimes chained to desks for security, and regularly inspected for damage. The quiet, focused environment of the scriptorium and library provided the ideal conditions for deep and sustained study. Nuns would spend hours poring over manuscripts, cross-referencing ideas, and committing passages to memory. This systematic engagement with complex texts fostered a discipline of thought and an ability to analyze and synthesize information that was far beyond the intellectual demands of most medieval occupations. An illustrative example of the depth of these collections can be seen at the Cistercian Abbey of Maubusin in France. Its library, through meticulous inventories, is understood to have held hundreds of volumes by the 14th century, encompassing not just theological works but also medical texts, legal commentaries, and even works on natural philosophy. Nuns at Maubusin would consult these texts not only for their spiritual duties, but also for managing the convent's infirmary, its estates, and its legal standing. The ability to access a wide range of written knowledge meant that nuns had a much broader intellectual horizon than most men, who were largely limited to what they could learn through oral tradition, apprenticeship, or the very basic teachings of local clergy. Their libraries were powerhouses of accumulated knowledge, giving nuns a unique intellectual advantage in a world where information was scarce and literacy was a privilege. Number 4. Medical knowledge. In an era when formal medical training was rudimentary and inaccessible to most medieval nuns frequently served as primary healthcare providers, not just for their own communities but often for the surrounding populace. Their convents frequently housed infirmaries that functioned as sophisticated hospitals for their time, equipped with medicinal gardens and a wealth of accumulated knowledge about herbal remedies and basic treatments. This medical understanding was systematically cultivated and passed down through generations of nuns, often reaching a level of expertise far surpassing the casual knowledge of most men. For instance, while a village barber surgeon might perform bloodletting or extract teeth, nuns engaged in a more holistic and often more effective approach to care. Records suggest that at the Abbey of Hildegard in the 12th century, the nuns possessed extensive knowledge of diagnostic practices for various ailments, often identifying illnesses through careful observation. cultivation of medicinal gardens was central to their medical practice. These gardens were carefully planned and maintained, often containing hundreds of different plant species, each with known therapeutic properties. Nuns would meticulously study these plants, understanding their growth cycles, their specific uses, and the best methods for preparing remedies. They understood which herbs were pain relievers, which were anti-inflammatories, and which aided digestion. For example, Sister Amelie of the Convent of Fontevraud, according to detailed convent chronicles, was known for her expertise in preparing balms from comfrey for broken bones and poultices from plantain for wounds. Her notes, passed down through the generations, detailed the precise quantities and preparation methods for each remedy, a level of empirical data collection rare in general society. This was not simply folk knowledge. It was an organized, experiential science. Nuns also possessed practical knowledge of basic anatomy and physiology, albeit rudimentary by modern standards. Through the care of the sick and the observation of the body's responses to illness and treatment, they gained insights into how the body functioned. They understood the importance of hygiene, wound care, and dietary adjustments for recovery. While surgical procedures were generally avoided, they were adept at setting simple fractures, dressing wounds to prevent infection, and managing fevers. The infirmary at the Abbey of St. Mary at Cistercian, a prominent example, is understood to have had dedicated rooms for different types of patients, indicating an organized approach to patient care, including isolation for infectious diseases and specialized diets for recovery. This level of institutionalized care was virtually non-existent for the average man, who relied on family, local healers, or the highly risky interventions of uneducated practitioners. Beyond direct medical care, nuns also compiled medical texts and herbals, which were invaluable repositories of knowledge. These manuscripts documented their observations, recipes, and successful treatments, ensuring that their medical wisdom was preserved and disseminated. Hildegard of Bingen, a prominent abbess of the 12th century, famously wrote comprehensive medical texts, Physica and Causae Curae, which detailed hundreds of plants, animals, and minerals and their medicinal uses, along with explanations of human health and disease. Her works demonstrate a profound observational and systematic approach to medicine that was far ahead of her time, laying foundations for future medical understanding. Her extensive knowledge, a testament to the intellectual environment of the convent, highlights how nuns were not just caregivers, but significant contributors to the medical understanding of the medieval world, often providing a level of care and expertise that was simply unavailable to the vast majority of the male population. Number 5. Artistic expression. While the image of medieval men often centers on warfare, trade, or manual labor, medieval nuns were deeply immersed in a world of artistic creation, producing works of beauty and intricacy that showcase a high level of skill, patience, and intellectual engagement. Their convents were often vibrant centers of artistic production, where skills were honed and creativity flourished, a stark contrast to the often utilitarian or crude artistic output accessible to most laymen. One of the most prominent forms of their artistic expression was the creation of illuminated manuscripts. This painstaking process involved not only the precise copying of text, but also the elaborate decoration of the pages with intricate illustrations, ornate capital letters, and vibrant borders. Nuns prepared the parchment, mixed pigments from natural sources like plants and minerals, and applied gold leaf with astonishing precision. Records from the German Abbey of Essen revealed that the nuns in the 10th and 11th centuries produced some of the most exquisite gospel books and psalters, characterized by their brilliant colors and detailed imagery, depicting biblical scenes, saints, and complex symbolic motifs. This level of miniature painting and calligraphy required not only artistic talent, but also a deep understanding of theological symbolism and narrative. Beyond manuscript illumination, nuns were masters of textiles and embroidery. They created elaborate vestments for religious services, altar cloths, tapestries, and banners, often adorned with intricate patterns and narrative scenes. These works were not simply decorative. They conveyed stories and theological messages, requiring careful design and meticulous execution. The Bayeux tapestry, while not made by nuns, shows the kind of detailed narrative embroidery that nuns were adept at, albeit on a smaller scale for liturgical purposes. The Convent of Sion in Sweden, it is understood that nuns were highly skilled in the art of needlework, producing pieces that were sought after by noble families and churches across the region. Their ability to translate complex designs into fabric, using various stitches and thread types, demonstrated a sophistication of craft and an eye for detail that few outside specialized workshops could match. Musical composition was another significant area of artistic expression for medieval nuns. While men dominated official liturgical music in cathedrals, many nuns composed hymns, antiphons, and sequences for use within their own convent services. These compositions often reflected a deep theological understanding and a profound spiritual connection. The most famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, whose vast body of musical works, including the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelation, Shanks's remarkable originality, melodic complexity, and spiritual depth. Her compositions were not merely chants. They were elaborate pieces, structured to convey specific theological ideas, requiring a sophisticated understanding of musical theory and harmony. This level of compositional skill was extremely rare, even among educated men of the time, and virtually unheard of outside the monastic or clerical spheres. Furthermore, nuns often contributed to the architectural design and decoration of their convents. While male master masons executed the main construction, nuns frequently advised on the layout of chapels, the design of altars, and the ornamentation of interiors, reflecting their spiritual vision and aesthetic preferences. They often oversaw the creation of stained glass windows, sculptures, and frescoes that adorned their sacred spaces. Convent of Königsfelden, for instance, is noted for its beautiful stained glass windows, believed to have been designed and perhaps even partially executed by the nuns themselves, depicting religious scenes with vibrant colors and intricate patterns. This multifaceted artistic engagement, spanning visual arts, textile arts, and music, allowed nuns to express profound spiritual and intellectual ideas through creative mediums, making them significant contributors. Number 6. Administrative squilts. Far from being cloistered and detached from the world, medieval nuns, especially abbesses, were often highly skilled administrators, managing complex institutions that were significant economic and social entities. The smooth functioning of a large medieval abbey required a sophisticated understanding of finance, property management, personnel, and legal matters, skills that were rarely possessed by the average man, whose responsibilities were often limited to personal or familial concerns. Abbesses, in particular, operated as powerful feudal lords, overseeing vast estates that included agricultural lands, mills, workshops, and sometimes even entire villages. They had to manage revenue and expenditure, collect rents, oversee agricultural production, and ensure the well-being of their tenants and employees. Records from the Abbey of Quedlinburg, a powerful imperial abbey in Germany, show that its abbesses in the 10th and 11th centuries controlled extensive territories, issued charters, and even commanded their own military retinues, demonstrating a level of administrative and political peril, demonstrating a level of the woman and indeed for most men. Nuns meticulously kept account books, recording income from land donations and various enterprises, as well as expenditures for food, building maintenance, and charitable work. They had to budget effectively, invest wisely, and manage large sums of money, often in different currencies. The convent of Barking Abbey in England is understood to have maintained incredibly detailed financial ledgers through several centuries, allowing its abbesses to track every penny planned for future needs and identify areas for efficiency. This precise financial oversight was a specialized skill, far beyond the capabilities of most men, who largely dealt with bartering or simple cash transactions on a much smaller scale. The complexity of managing an institution's finances required not just arithmetic, but strategic thinking and long-term planning. Personnel management was another vital administrative skill. A large convent could house dozens, if not hundreds, of nuns, novices, lay sisters, and servants. The abbess and her council had to manage their daily lives, resolve disputes, assign duties, and ensure discipline. This required strong leadership, diplomacy, and an understanding of human nature. They were responsible for the spiritual and physical well-being of their community. For example, Abbess Gertrude of the Convent of Helfta was known for her exceptional leadership, guiding her community through periods of challenge and growth, ensuring both spiritual devotion and practical efficiency within the convent. This role demanded the ability to command respect and make difficult decisions, a nuanced skill in managing a large and diverse group of individuals. Furthermore, abbesses frequently engaged in legal matters, negotiating with local lords, bishops, and even royalty over land rights, tithes, and jurisdictional disputes. They had to understand medieval law, present their cases effectively, and protect the convent's interests. This often involved extensive correspondence, drafting legal documents, and sometimes even appearing in court. The Abbey of Shaftesbury, a wealthy English convent, was frequently involved in land disputes, and its abbesses consistently demonstrated shrewd legal acumen in protecting their endowments and privileges, often against powerful male adversaries. Their ability to navigate the complex legal landscape and defend their institutions demonstrated a significant intellectual and practical understanding of legal systems and property rights, a domain usually dominated by male clerks and lawyers. The administrative prowess of medieval nuns was a testament to their education and practical intelligence, enabling them to govern complex institutions with a level of skill and foresight that was exceptional for their time, surpassing the administrative capacities of most men. Number 7. Theological study. While a basic understanding of Christian doctrine was widespread, medieval nuns often delved into theological study with a depth and rigor that was unparalleled among the general populace and rivaled many male scholars and clergy. Their lives were dedicated to God, and this devotion often manifested in profound intellectual engagement with sacred texts, patristic writings, and systematic theology. For nuns, theological study was not just an academic pursuit. It was a path to spiritual enlightenment and a central part of their daily life. They were expected to read and meditate on the Bible extensively, often studying it in its original Latin. This involved not just reading the text, but interpreting its meaning, understanding its historical context, and applying its lessons to their lives. Records from the Convent of Gandersheim, for example, reveal that the nuns regularly engaged in biblical exegesis, discussing different interpretations of Scripture and debating theological points. This level of critical engagement with sacred texts was far more sophisticated than the rote memorization of prayers or basic catechism common among most laymen. Beyond the Bible, nuns immersed themselves in the works of the Church Fathers, such as St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Gregory the Great, and others. These monumental texts contain centuries of Christian thought, philosophy, and interpretation. Understanding them required a significant intellectual effort, a grasp of complex arguments, and an ability to synthesize vast amounts of information. For instance, at the Abbey of Helfta in the 13th century, nuns like Mechhild of Magdeburg and Gertrude the Great engaged deeply with mystical theology, exploring the nature of divine love and union with God. Their writings, which were widely read and influential, demonstrate a profound theological insight and a mastery of spiritual concepts that extended far beyond popular devotion. This intellectual pursuit of theological understanding placed them among the most educated individuals of their time, regardless of gender. Many nuns also contributed to theological discourse through their own writings, commentaries, and visions. These works often explored profound spiritual questions, offered new interpretations of Scripture, or articulated unique theological perspectives. Hildegard of Bingen, a towering intellectual figure of the 12th century, wrote extensively on theology, cosmology, and mysticism. Her major theological work, Civias, Know the Ways, is a collection of visionary experiences that explore the mysteries of God, creation, and salvation, presented with a complex symbolic framework and rich theological detail. Her writings were so influential that she corresponded with popes, emperors, and leading abbots, demonstrating a level of theological authority and respect that few women, or indeed many men of her time, could achieve. Her work reveals an astonishing capacity for theological innovation and systematic thought. The structured environment of the convent, with its emphasis on study, contemplation, and communal discussion, provided an ideal setting for deep theological inquiry. Nuns engaged in Lectio Divina, a practice of prayerful reading that involved slow, meditative engagement with Scripture, leading to profound spiritual and intellectual insights. They also participated in formal and informal discussions, debating theological points and sharing their understanding. This continuous intellectual engagement with theological concepts allowed them to develop a sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine, ethics, and spirituality, often far exceeding the theological knowledge of the average priest, let alone the average layman. Their commitment to theological study made them significant intellectual forces, contributing to the rich tapestry of medieval thought and demonstrating an intellectual prowess that challenged conventional gender roles of the era. Number 8. Musical education. While many men in medieval society had some exposure to music through folk songs or basic church chants, medieval nuns often received a highly sophisticated and rigorous musical education that encompassed not only performance, but also composition and theoretical understanding. Music was an integral part of their daily life within the convent, central to the divine office and private devotion, and this necessity fostered an environment where musical skills were meticulously cultivated. From a young age, novices were trained in Gregorian chant, the foundational music of the medieval church. This involved mastering complex melodies, understanding precise rhythms, and developing strong vocal control. It was not simply singing. It required an understanding of liturgical nuances, Latin pronunciation, and the spiritual meaning embedded in each chant. Records from the convent of Las Huelgas in Spain, a prominent Cistercian abbey, indicate that its nuns maintained a choir renowned for its exceptional vocal purity and precise execution of complex liturgical chancela. This level of choral discipline and artistry was a result of years of dedicated training and practice. Beyond vocal performance, some convents also provided instruction in playing musical instruments. While not as common as vocal training, some communities possessed organs, harps, or other instruments that were used to accompany chants or for private devotion. The Benedictine nuns of Seckau, in the 12th century, for example, are understood to have included sisters who were skilled organists, providing accompaniment for their elaborate liturgical services. Learning to play an instrument in the medieval period required significant dedication and access to instruction, something that was rare outside of monastic or aristocratic circles. For most men, instrumental music was limited to simple folk instruments or military fanfares, lacking the complexity and theoretical grounding taught in convents. Perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval nuns' musical education was their capacity for composition. While official church music was largely composed by men, many nuns created original hymns, antiphons, and sequences for use within their own communities. These compositions often focate remarkable creativity, melodic innovation, and a deep understanding of musical theory. The most celebrated example is Hildegard of Bingen, whose extensive body of musical works, including the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, is considered a masterpiece of medieval music. Her compositions, such as the haunting O Viridissima Virga, are complex soaring melodies that move beyond the strictures of traditional Gregorian chant, incorporating wider vocal ranges and intricate melodic lines. She not only composed the music but also wrote the texts, demonstrating a fusion of poetic, theological, and musical genius. Her work was highly influential, and she corresponded with leading musical figures and clergy, indicating the high regard in which her musical talents were held. The musical education in convents went beyond mere performance. It encompassed a theoretical understanding of music, including modes, intervals, and harmonic structures. Nuns would study treatises on music theory and apply these principles in their singing and composition. This systematic approach to music as an academic discipline was a privilege rarely afforded to men outside of university settings or specialized cathedral schools. The sustained communal practice of music, combined with theoretical instruction and the opportunity for creative expression, transformed convents into centers of musical excellence. The musical prowess of medieval nuns stands as a powerful testament to their comprehensive education and their profound contributions to the cultural and artistic life of the Middle Ages, setting them apart from the vast majority of men whose musical knowledge rarely extended beyond the most basic forms. Number 9. Knowledge of languages. In an age when most people spoke only their local dialect and literacy in any language was a privilege, medieval nuns often possessed a remarkable command of multiple languages, particularly Latin, which was the international language of scholarship, theology, and administration. For a nun, fluency in Latin was not an optional extra. It was the cornerstone of her intellectual and spiritual life. From the moment she entered the convent, she was immersed in a Latin-speaking and Latin-reading environment. The divine office, the daily cycle of prayers and readings, was entirely in Latin, requiring not just pronunciation but also a deep understanding of the language's grammar, vocabulary, and syntax. Records from the Benedictine Abbey of Barking in England indicate that its nuns were fluent in Latin, reading complex theological treatises and classical texts with ease. This level of Latin mastery enabled them to access the vast body of knowledge contained in written works across Europe, something almost impossible for the vast majority of men who were limited to their vernacular. Beyond basic fluency, many nuns achieved a scholarly mastery of Latin. They wrote their own texts in Latin, including theological treatises, letters, and chronicles. This required an ability to craft elegant prose, employ rhetorical devices, and express complex ideas with precision. Abbesses, in particular, often corresponded with influential figures across Europe, bishops, kings, and even popes, all in Latin. Their letters were not simple messages but carefully constructed diplomatic communications, demonstrating a high level of linguistic skill and intellectual sophistication. For example, the correspondence of Hildegard of Bingen reveals her remarkable command of Latin, allowing her to engage in nuanced theological and political discussions with the most powerful figures of her time. Her ability to articulate complex visions and spiritual teachings in scholarly Latin set her apart as a significant intellectual force. While Latin was paramount, some nuns also possessed knowledge of other languages, though this was less common. This might include a rudimentary understanding of Greek, especially for those who engaged with original Greek New Testament texts or patristic writings that had not yet been fully translated. In convents with specific cross-cultural ties, or those located near linguistic borders, nuns might also have acquired proficiency in other vernacular languages, particularly for administrative purposes or for interacting with local communities. For instance, at convents in regions with mixed populations, like parts of Spain or the Holy Roman Empire, Nuns might have learned local dialects to manage their estates or provide care to their tenants. This practical linguistic flexibility further broadened their intellectual horizons. Constant immersion in Latin texts and discourse within the convent fostered an environment of superior linguistic education. Nuns were not just passively consuming information. They were actively engaging with the language through reading, writing, and speaking. They debated theological points in Latin, copied Latin manuscripts in the scriptorium, and composed original works in the language. This rigorous linguistic training provided them with direct access to centuries of philosophical, theological, and scientific thought, granting them an intellectual advantage over most men who were bound by the limitations of their local vernacular. Their multilingual capabilities, especially their mastery of Latin, made them significant figures in the transmission and development of knowledge during the medieval period, enabling them to participate in the broader European intellectual sphere in ways that were inaccessible to the vast majority of their male contemporaries. Number 10. Intellectual community. Unlike most medieval men, whose intellectual lives were often isolated or limited to practical knowledge related to their trade or status, medieval nuns often lived within vibrant intellectual communities that fostered shared learning, discussions, and extensive networks of correspondence. The convent provided a unique environment where intellectual curiosity was not only encouraged but integrated into daily life, creating a supported space for scholarly pursuits. Within the cloister walls, nuns engaged in communal study, debating theological concepts, analyzing scripture, and discussing philosophical ideas. These intellectual exchanges were a fundamental part of their spiritual and academic development. For instance, at the Convent of Helfta in the 13th century, figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg, Gertrude the Great, and Mechthild of Hackeborn formed a close-knit intellectual circle. They shared their mystical experiences, collaborated on spiritual texts, and critiqued each other's theological insights, creating a dynamic environment of shared intellectual growth. This kind of structured and sustained intellectual interaction was a rarity outside of the nascent universities, which were predominantly male institutions. Mentoring was a crucial aspect of these intellectual communities. Older, more experienced nuns would guide younger novices and sisters in their studies, helping them to navigate complex texts, develop their theological understanding, and refine their writing skills. This personalized instruction and intellectual apprenticeship provided a level of education far superior to the informal and often limited instruction available to most men through apprenticeships or family knowledge. Transmission of knowledge within the convent was systematic and deliberate, ensuring that intellectual traditions were preserved and advanced across generations. The legacy of profound intellectual women like Hildegard of Bingen, for example, was carried forward by her successors and disciples, who continued to study her works and expand upon her ideas within their own communities. Beyond the internal community, nuns often maintained extensive correspondence networks with other convents, male monastic orders, bishops, scholars, and even political figures. These letters were not merely social greetings. They were often sophisticated intellectual exchanges, discussing theological questions, seeking advice, or sharing insights. These networks allowed nuns to participate in broader intellectual currents across Europe, overcoming the geographical isolation that characterized much of medieval life. For instance, the letters of Euphemia of the Convent of Essen, as recorded in their historical archives, document her intellectual exchanges with prominent scholars and abbots regarding liturgical reforms and biblical interpretation. This capacity for cross-institutional intellectual engagement was highly sophisticated and rare outside of the male clerical elite. The shared access to extensive libraries, coupled with the leisure time available for study and reflection, provided an ideal setting for intellectual development within the convent. Unlike many men who were engaged in physically demanding labor or constant warfare, nuns had dedicated time for intellectual pursuits. The communal living fostered an environment where intellectual discoveries and spiritual insights were shared, critiqued, and built upon, creating a collective body of knowledge. This intellectual collaboration, mentorship, and widespread correspondence formed a vibrant intellectual community that allowed medieval nuns to cultivate and express their intellectual capabilities to a degree that far surpassed the opportunities and achievements. Number 11. Teaching and pedagogy. While men were the primary teachers in universities and cathedral schools, medieval nuns played a crucial role in education, particularly for girls and women, often establishing institutions with sophisticated pedagogical methods that were far more developed than the informal, often practical, training most boys received. Nuns were not only educated themselves, but were also educators, cultivating knowledge within their communities and at times beyond their walls. The primary recipients of their teaching were the novices and younger nuns within the convent. This involved a structured curriculum that included Latin, grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, and theology. New entrants, regardless of their prior education, were systematically taught to read and write, to understand complex Latin texts, and to master the intricacies of the divine office. Records from the Abbey of Whitby, notably under the leadership of Saint Hilda in the 7th century, indicate that it became a renowned center of learning where both men and women were educated, with several scholars and bishops emerging from its hallowed halls, a testament to the rigorous pedagogical practices employed by the nuns. Teaching methods in convents were often interactive and multifaceted. They involved recitation, memorization, and the copying of texts to reinforce learning. Nuns would lead discussions, answer questions, and provide individual instruction, adapting their teaching to the needs of each student. The systematic nature of their education, with its clear progression from basic literacy to advanced theological and philosophical concepts, provided a comprehensive intellectual foundation. For example, a young novice might begin by copying simple Latin phrases, gradually progressing to complex biblical passages, and eventually engaging with the nuanced arguments of church fathers. This gradual mastery, guided by experienced teachers, was a stark contrast to the often haphazard and apprenticeship-based learning common for most men, which rarely included formal literacy or theoretical knowledge. Beyond educating their own sisters, many convents also ran schools for noble girls. These schools provided an education that was often superior to what girls could receive at home and, in some cases, even rivaled what boys learned in early grammar schools. Curriculum for these noble girls typically included not only religious instruction and basic literacy, but also skills such as needlework, music, and household management, preparing them for roles in aristocratic society. The Abbey of Notre-Dame de Soissons, for instance, was known for educating daughters of the French aristocracy, providing them with a refined education that included Latin, history, and the arts. This commitment to formal education for girls was unique to convents, as most lay families lacked the resources or expertise to provide such a comprehensive learning environment. Abbesses, as the heads of their communities, often played a significant role in defining the educational standards and curriculum of their convents. They oversaw the teaching staff, acquired educational materials, and ensured the intellectual flourishing of their nuns and students. Pedagogical expertise developed within convents was not merely practical. It often reflected a deep understanding of how best to transmit knowledge and foster intellectual growth. Their schools and teaching methods contributed significantly to the preservation and dissemination of learning in an age where formal educational institutions were scarce. The role of medieval nuns as educators, systematically imparting knowledge and fostering intellectual development within their communities and beyond, stands as a powerful indicator of their sophisticated understanding of pedagogy and their commitment to intellectual cultivation, far exceeding the educational capacities available to the vast majority of men in their time. Number 12. Preservation of knowledge. In an era before widespread printing, when books were precious and laboriously crafted, medieval nuns played an indispensable role in the preservation of knowledge, meticulously copying and safeguarding manuscripts that contained centuries of human thought. Their convents were often bastions of literacy and scholarship, acting as living libraries and scriptoria that ensured the survival of countless texts, both sacred and secular, that might otherwise have been lost to history. This dedication to manuscript production and archiving demonstrated a profound intellectual commitment that far surpassed the casual engagement with knowledge found among most men. The scriptorium, a dedicated room within the convent, was a hive of quiet, disciplined activity. Here, nuns would spend countless hours, often in silence, preparing parchment, sharpening quills, mixing inks from natural pigments, and carefully transcribing texts. This was not a quick task. Copying a single book could take months or even years, demanding incredible patience, precision, and an intimate familiarity with Latin, the script, and the content itself. Records from the Abbey of Essen indicate that its nuns produced a significant number of illuminated manuscripts, not only for their own use, but also as gifts for patrons and other religious institutions. Spreading literacy and knowledge, types of texts preserved by nuns were remarkably diverse. While sacred texts, like the Bible, liturgical books, and commentaries on Scripture were paramount, nuns also copied and safeguarded classical Latin works, philosophical treatises, historical chronicles, scientific texts, and even legal documents. For example, some convents are understood to have held copies of Roman authors like Seneca or Ovid, ensuring that these pillars of classical education continued to exist and be studied. The meticulousness of their work was crucial for the accurate transmission of these texts across generations. They were aware of the importance of accuracy, often comparing different versions of a text to ensure fidelity, a practice that mirrored the work of modern textual critics. This commitment to precision prevented errors from proliferating and ensured the integrity of the knowledge contained within the manuscripts. Beyond copying, nuns were also responsible for the systematic archiving and protection of their convent's library. Books were carefully catalogued, shelved, and maintained, often in dedicated library rooms designed to protect them from moisture, pests, and fire. The very existence of these organized collections, many of which survived for centuries, stands as a testament to the nuns' foresight and dedication to intellectual heritage. The library at the Abbey of Quedlinburg, a powerful imperial abbey, is noted for its extensive collection of historical and theological works, many of which were copied and maintained by the nuns themselves, ensuring their preservation through various political upheavals. The act of preserving these books was not merely a chore. It was a profound act of intellectual stewardship, safeguarding the wisdom of the past for future generations. In a world where illiteracy was the norm and the destruction of books during warfare or neglect was common, the convents of medieval nuns stood as crucial centers for the preservation of knowledge. Their diligent labor in the scriptorium and their careful maintenance of libraries ensure that countless works of literature, philosophy, theology, and science survived the ravages of time. This systematic and dedicated effort to preserve intellectual heritage sets medieval nuns apart, demonstrating an intellectual engagement and a contribution to the continuity of human knowledge that far exceeded the efforts or capabilities of the vast majority of men in their era, making them true guardians of civilization's accumulated wisdom.